doing well. How are you today?
I'm doing great.
I'm good. Thank you so much again for taking the time to sit down and talk with me about this book. I'm really excited and I'm glad we're able to schedule this.
Oh, well, thank you for wanting to talk to me about it.
Yeah, so I'm Sam, and today I'm going to be interviewing you, Kim, about your new book, For Girls Who Walk Through Fire. And I was wondering if you'd like to introduce yourself to people who may be watching.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Kim DeRose. I grew up in Santa Barbara, California, which is where the book takes place. I now live in New York City, and I am a writer amongst many other things. And this is my first, not the first book I've written, but my first book being published.
Wonderful. And I just want to extend a congratulations for publishing this debut YA novel. I want to say I really love this story. I think the narratives you told about healing, revenge, justice, empowerment, and friendship were balanced so well and told through such compelling characters. So thank you for just publishing this piece and having it tell such an important story.
Oh, thank you
Um,
for saying that.
yeah, thank you. And then I guess before we delve into the specifics of this novel, I was wondering how your background in film directing at UCLA kind of influenced your approach to writing this novel.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the funny thing is, ironically, I studied documentary, so which obviously has a narrative, but is very different, right? Because you're not necessarily writing the narrative; you're really kind of finding it as you go. Um, but I would say, and someone asked me, "Well, do you think that you ended up as a writer because you went to film school?" I actually think I went to film school because I was a writer, because that was my childhood dream. And I kind of lost it along the way, like a lot of people do when they think like, "Oh, that's not really realistic." I ended up going to film school, which I don't know if that was a realistic dream. It's not like that's easy either. But it somehow seemed more legitimate because there's a big industry. And anyways, I did really love it, but I don't think I think I ended up there because in my core, I wanted to write. And I was really scared of that. So I think maybe that's also why I chose documentary and not, I felt very clear, like, oh, I don't write stories. Like, I'm not gonna, no. I'm just gonna show up with a camera and film real life. But I do think being in film school really shaped my understanding of story because, I mean, I think a couple of things. Like one, going to art school is just was such a, I mean, just to be in, like, I was really lucky. I was with a group of 21 people total, and they were all so creative and thoughtful and empathetic and like just amazing people. So I lucked out that it was such a good group of people. So anytime you're immersed with other creative people and get to collaborate, like that just does something for you, even if the thing you end up creating ends up not being a film, but like something else. I think that really helped. And then I also think I did end up thinking about storytelling a lot because film is in many ways really similar to, like, you're thinking about character motivation. And even if it wasn't a film that I was creating, I mean, I was working with people on their projects and you very closely collaborate, you're giving each other feedback. So there was a lot of thought around character motivations, how you tell a story, story structure. So I think just having the benefit of being in that space and thinking about those things did end up influencing my writing later. And probably, I also think because I went to film school, as I'm writing, uh, often I sort of imagine it as a film, which probably a lot of writers do, even if they didn't go to film school. But I think I probably have that as an added element just from that experience.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think reading your book, it was so like the imagery was so vivid and descriptive that I felt almost like I was there, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, I guess your background in filmmaking definitely kind of explains that aspect of it. It is something I really appreciated about the novel. So that was really cool. And then this story, so the story was set in high school, and followed the narratives of four high school girls. And I was curious, did you always intend for it to be like set in this high school and targeted towards a young adult audience, or was there ever a time where it was maybe a more mature audience that you were targeting and then it shifted? Like, what was the intention for targeting it to YA?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I did always imagine it for YA from the start. And I think I've always wanted to write YA. So, and maybe at some point middle grade and children's book, but like always looking at that, especially YA, like that's always been an audience I really care about and want to write for. So I don't think I ever entertained the idea of doing it for an older audience. I think there's probably, I mean, I hope that an older audience will read it and also it'll really resonate, because I think there's some pretty universal experiences. But I think part of why I really care about writing YA is I think I mean, it's such a pivotal point in your life. You know, you're still figuring out so much, you know, so much about yourself, and you're still learning about yourself. And um, I think there's, you know, big things you're going through. And so I think that's part of the reason. I also think, um, you know, a lot of these things that are happening to the characters in the book, I mean, they're happening to people who are that age all the time, and they might not be talking about it openly, or they might. And so that was another thing I was really conscious of. And certainly because, I mean, you know, I can think back to being that age, and just the things that I knew about that were happening in my community that didn't really get addressed or dealt with or talked about. So yeah, never did I think about doing it for an older audience. It was always YA.
Yeah, that's great. And I think your characters, like I mentioned before, are just so compelling throughout the novel. And I was curious about your choice to kind of alternate perspectives, because at the
Mhm.
beginning I felt like Elliot had such a strong voice. And so when I was first reading like Elliot's perspective in the first chapter, I thought it would be all Elliot. And then you kind of shift perspectives, and each girl has an equally strong but very unique voice. And so I was kind of wondering what went into the choice to alternate between these perspectives, and how
Yeah.
do you kind of navigate like getting inside each character's head and finding their unique voice?
Yeah. Oh, and apologies if you can hear my dog, because
Oh,
of
no
course he
worries.
took this moment to make himself known. Classic. Yeah, you know, it's a good question. I think I knew pretty early on. I mean, I knew I wanted a group of girls. I knew I wanted it to be a diverse range of experiences, both like the incidences that they've experienced, but also their lived experiences. And I knew that I wanted to be able to not just hear about them, but to actually like be with them. But also, I mean, Elliot is obviously the protagonist. It really is, you know, I mean, she's the one that leads us and starts the coven. And um, I think I think that the way that, you know, not to give too many spoilers, but like when they join their group and they decide the order in which they're going to go in, that was kind of a nice story structure of like how I was going to choose to go to different characters' perspectives, especially never having written something where I alternate perspectives. That was my first time doing that. And so I did have the question of like, oh yeah, how do you decide when you're going to go to different, like to this character? And there was something kind of built in where I just started to, I thought like, okay, well, I have a sense of the order in which they're going to conjure their spells. And that kind of created a bit of a structure. And then I think I just started to feel like, oh, I think I want to be with this person now. Or it just started to feel a little bit more intuitive as I went. And then I think in terms of developing their voices, it's interesting because I think that's a process over time too. And you know, I had a sense of them at the beginning, and I had backstories for each of them were pretty detailed. But obviously, you know, when I was writing probably the first draft or so, even when we were going to their experiences, and especially when we were with Elliot, I think I was kind of centered more with her. And when I ended up doing was kind of doing like a shadow version of all of the scenes where I would like kind of not write the full scene, but like I would write out everything that happened when they're together. I would write it from each of their perspectives, knowing that most of it would never go in the book. But then that kind of guided like what's happening with each of them. And so that when we come back to them, I had a sense of like where they had been emotionally, even if we weren't with them in that moment. And then also thinking about like what else was going on in their world. So I mean, in that sense, I would say probably film school aided in that, because you spend so much time talking about character motivation, and especially if you worked with actors at all, which I did do some of, you think about a lot of that and backstories. So I think that also helped with some of that.
Yeah. And I will say, I feel like the different progressions and like changing the switches between character perspectives felt very natural throughout the book. So I think like hearing you say that you wrote it for all of them and then having to like cut out pieces, and it makes sense, and it's evident in the novel that there was a lot of thought put into when each character starts their perspective, and like so I really appreciated that and all the extensive work it seems like you did with that. And then I was really curious, what made you want to tell this story with like fantasy and witchcraft? Like why not just make it a regular YA novel? Why include that element of fantasy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's another one where I think that's always been the thing that I'm drawn to. I mean, I love a full range of stories, right? Like I read everything, both in YA and adult fiction. I think I'm always drawn to fantasy in particular, both as a reader and definitely as a writer, just because there's something about I mean, you can tell a story straightforward, and I think that's very important to be able to see just your real world experience mirrored back to you. But there's something about the infusion of magic and or just genre, like using a genre in general, that kind of, I guess, frees me up a little bit as a writer to then talk about something maybe a little bit more sideways or through metaphor a bit more, or just, the use of fantasy and magic. I don't know, creatively that just always resonates for me. I also just think it's fun. I mean, I just love anything with like ghosts and, cemeteries and witches and, I mean, I love Alice Hoffman and like everything she's written about, like starting with practical magic and before and after all of her books. So yeah, I think there's an element of like me just being drawn to things that are kind of magical or sometimes dark. But yeah, then creatively being able to maybe talk about things in a slightly different way that sort of just excites me and frees me up a bit.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I like hearing you talk about your inspirations for the book as well. And it did put me in very much in a fall mood, which I appreciate. I'm ready for fall to start.
Good.
So yeah, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it as well. And kind of delving more into like relationships between characters. The four female main leads were incredibly compelling, as I've said, but something else I found really beautiful was like the relationships they had with other characters, especially thinking about like Otis and Bee, and then Elliot's father and Elliot. I thought those relationships were especially beautiful and touching throughout the novel. And so I was curious about your inspiration behind these side characters, I guess, and why their voices were so critical to include in this book.
Oh yeah, and you just named two of my favorite side characters. I love Otis, Bee's twin brother, and I love Elliot's dad. And I think one of the things that felt really important is, I mean, obviously this is about a group of girls and their personal experiences, and I thought a lot about like, well, what's that coven, and are there boys that are invited? Like, does it expand out? I mean, when you're thinking about a story like this, I mean, obviously people that are impacted by sexual abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment, I mean, it's pretty expansive, so you could tell a lot of stories. But ultimately I really thought, no, this is the story that I'm telling right now in this moment. But I wasn't really interested in getting into giving too much page time to the individuals that have caused them harm. That was really conscious of like, I don't, this is not about them. But I did want to show, I guess, two things. One, some of the relationships that they have in their life, and certainly like how what they're going through impacts those relationships. Are they letting them in? Are they not letting that person in? How does that shift over time? But also, especially with Elliot's dad and Otis, having a representation of boys and men who are really positive influences in their life and progressive and examples of the opposite of toxic masculinity. So yeah, that felt important to me with both of them. And I think, interestingly, in both instances with Bee and Otis and Elliot and her dad, both of those also just came very naturally. I just had a sense of like who these people were and these like deep relationships they had. And I also think, with Elliot's dad, I mean, I'm a parent, so I've got a 10-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. And I think writing his character, I sort of thought about who I am as a parent and what I would want to express to a child. And also my husband is an amazing father
Mhm.
and partner. And so I really thought about who he is as a father and how he would handle things and what he would do. And so it's probably a combination of those two things that then got fed in a little bit to Elliot's dad.
Yeah, and those character relationships just provided such heartwarming stories throughout the novel, which I really enjoyed. And a time like in a novel that addresses some very bleak elements,
Huh.
those are really touching points in the piece. So it was great hearing you talk about that. And then a large part of this book focuses on these female relationships as well, like the relationships between the girls, and overcoming like preconceived notions about other women. I felt like Elliot sometimes has these perception of the girls around her that might not necessarily be the most accurate. And then you see like her growth as a character and all of them growing in these relationships. Why do you think that was like an important message to send your young adult audience reading this book? that these.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, it's probably an important message to send adults as well.
Yeah.
That instinct to kind of judge people and think you know their life when you don't. I mean, I think we all are guilty of that, right? It's like you have to really catch yourself doing that. And so I think it's important for a YA audience, but it's probably important beyond that. I mean, I think too that comes from some of my personal experiences. I haven't been in a support group like the one they attend, but I have been in other support groups, and this experience, especially the one that I was in New York City, um, where you go into a room and you have people from all walks of life, and you walk in and you just do make judgments about people. You just do. Like, I think, without even thinking, you come with your own ideas. And I was really struck, this one particular group I was part of, where how often I was proved wrong. Like the person that seemed like they had it the most together, when they spoke, their life was in shambles and they were falling apart. But you couldn't tell that. And then the person that walked in that kind of looked like, oh, they don't have it together, when they would speak, you were blown away with like just their intuition and their empathy and their insights. And seeing that time and time again, that was a real lesson to me of like, you just have no idea. Like, you just don't know. I mean, everyone's their own protagonist, first of all, right? Like, everyone's got their own story. And like, you don't know what they're going through, what their life is. And it's something I think I've just been conscious of from different perspectives. It's something I feel like is really important with my kids too, right? It's like we have we have our own experiences that we come to the table with. We have our own prejudices that are, we might be trying to work on them, but they might still be there. And so like, how do you call that attention to that? And I think that was something I was really interested in, was kind of like this almost like breakfast club set up at the beginning, where there's people from like different walks of life and we think we know, and Elliot thinks she's got her opinion about them. And how do we like show that actually, she doesn't know what she thinks she knows.
Yeah. And speaking of that, felt as though two of the characters that seem to kind of shock Elliot's like beliefs the most are Kaylee and Madeline. And they're not, their stories at the end kind of seem to stray a little bit from the other girls' progressions. So I was
Yeah.
curious what the motivations behind those characters were, and how you kind of crafted the end of their stories as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this will be a little bit of a spoiler alert, but I will
Mhm.
I will talk about it without trying to give too much away. But I think Kaylee, I mean, she doesn't choose to join them, right?
Mhm.
And so I was really interested in, I wanted there to be someone that, especially someone that we thought for sure would join them and then doesn't, and what are her motivations? And I mean, it's a good question of like, well, why doesn't she? Like, what's going on there? And is there something deeper to that why than what Elliot first sees? Because she doesn't understand it. Like, why would you not do this?
Mhm.
So I think that's what I was thinking about with Kaylee. And so she is always a little bit separate of the group. And I wanted us to have a sense of where she's going to be, but she's never really integrated with them in the same way. And then Madeline, I mean, I knew from the start I wanted to have a character who, I love the like type A intense, like Tracy Flick from Election, like where they can just go like intense and dark. Like, I'm really drawn to those sorts of stories, or those sorts of characters. So I knew I wanted to have a character, almost from the beginning, that would probably go the furthest and that would maybe not stay with the group, like would have their own ambitions, or it'd be a question of like, are they going to come back around? Are they going to stick with this group? Are they going to do their own thing? So I had that in mind for Madeline's story from the start. And when we leave her at the end, it is a question of like, where is she going to end up, and I have ideas for that. Not to say that I'm like going to write those ideas, but I have my own ideas of what I think that's going to look like for her. But I also think it's a question, like, giving into these dark tendencies can take you to places that are pretty bleak if you're not willing to do the actual work, that's underneath that impulse for the revenge.
Yeah. And then I guess that kind of leads me into one of our final questions. I loved reading your book, as I've mentioned, and it makes me excited about maybe potential works you have coming up in the future. So I wanted to see if there's anything you're working on now, or if readers can expect anything in the future, maybe any more ventures into the stories of any of these girls or different girls, anything you have in the works.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have a number of things in the works. I don't have anything that I can sort of
Yeah.
officially announce right now, but I do have a couple of different projects that I'm working on. One in particular that I'm probably most actively working on right now that I'm really excited about. And I can't really say too much about it at the moment. I would say it's not the same characters or same world, but there are some thematically some things that kind of dovetail with this story that make me excited about it. And then, I don't know if I'll ever do anything more with these particular characters. I felt like I feel like I told the story I really wanted to tell. It isn't to say that I would never do some sort of like offshoot if something came to me. But I think that's always a little tricky, of like, when you feel like you've said what you want to say, unless something really compelling comes up, I feel like, I don't know, I did my job there. But yeah, I hope to have, well, I mean, I would love to have many more young adult books that, come out in the future, but hopefully something in the near future.
Very exciting. I look forward to that and I'll keep an eye out for it.
Thank
Um,
you.
Thank you again so much for taking the time. If there's anything else you'd like to say about this book, or anything else you'd just like to contribute, I'll leave an open space here for you at the end. But
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I guess the only other thing I would say is, I mean, this is obviously it's a topic I'm really passionate about. I mean, not the witchcraft, although I am actually passionate about that too, and love witchy stuff and magic. No, but I think like the impacts of trauma and how we find pathways to healing. So I just want to put a shout out to the Me Too organization, Me Too International. Tarana Burke started that organization. I mean, she started it well before hashtag Me Too went viral. Really, in her, what's so cool about her work is she really centers around the individuals that are most impacted, and often don't get the support they needed. So, girls and women of color, queer and trans people. And so hashtag Me Too was awesome, but they have done so much more work. So I'm just a huge admirer of their organization, and I would say it's also a really great resource, not just to see what kind of advocacy work they're doing, but also for survivors. They have a sanctuary, like a survivor sanctuary, where they give a lot of really great resources and tools to find pathways to healing. Not everyone has the luxury of therapy. And so I just think it's important to know that that's out there if you need it. So that, if you're looking for where else to go with your feelings, or just you're interested in this topic, that's a really good place to start.
absolutely. Thank you so much. That was such an important shout out. I'm really glad you mentioned that. And thank you again for taking the time to speak with me. I really enjoyed this conversation and I really
Yeah,
enjoyed your book.
same.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so nice to meet you, and thank you for being interested in the book and supporting it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll let you know when this is all published. And I
Great.
appreciate your time and congratulations again.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, you as well. Bye.
Bye.